Zdravstvuyja, and welcome to episode 9 of my Soviet Union vlog. And last time we were looking at Stalin and his economy, and particularly the causes of Stalin's economic policies, and those first 3 5-year plans that go up to the Second World War. And this time we're looking at Stalin's economic policies after the war, the fourth 5-year plan, and then considering a little bit changing continuity and also successes versus failures. I remember that we're doing this because in the EdXL grand scheme of things, 10 years is the minimum exam question that you'll get, and you may well get quite a lot longer than that. So sometimes they cobble together 1917 through to the Second World War or through to 1950. Sometimes they might start even with the first 5-year plan and go all the way through to 64 and look for these bigger kind of thematic assessments rather than focusing in on one 5-year plan itself. So let's start by thinking about the impact of the Second World War on the Soviet Union. Obviously, it's massively devastating. Both the length of the war, but also the type of the war between the Nazis and the Soviets meant that there was mass destruction. And that has a huge impact economically. Just a few figures for you. Oil and steel production were both down a third by the end of the war from what they had been in 1940. Coal was down by a quarter. Farm production was down by 2/5. So if it had been 100 in 1940, it was down to 60 by the end of the war, and a little bit more about that later on. Nearly 100,000 kolkhozy were wrecked during the war. And of course, on top of all of this, there's a massive human cost of the war. As we say, pretty much every episode on the Soviet Union involved, massive human cost. In the war, between 20 and 30 million casualties. Plus, of course, on top of that, the people who suffered injuries or wounds, and 25 million people were made homeless. So huge impact, and therefore, really, most of the time, I would sort of say a lot of the, maybe all the advantages that the Soviet Union built up in the 30s are all kind of wiped away, erased by the Second War. That's a little bit simplistic because they still have that sort of base of knowledge and they are still making stuff that they weren't making at the start of the 30s, but nevertheless, massive impact. In that context, the fourth 5-year plan from 1945 to 1950 is genuinely remarkable. I think that by 1950, industrial output had recovered, really kind of back to, well, not just back to where it had been before the war, but also leapt forward. So, for example, coal more than doubled in its output between 1945 and 1950. And in 1950, it was up a third on where it had been in 1940 as well. And these are quite big numbers for coal. Electricity production more than doubled between 1945 and 50. Oil and steel both comfortably ahead of where they had been before 1940. So within 5 years, recovered completely from their position in 1940. Farm production is a little bit less kind of stellar in its success, but even that by 1950 was just about back to 1940 levels. And I read somewhere that consumer goods production doubled as well. So that sounds good. But that is kind of from a very low base. If I've got one toy that I've made before, now I've got two, I have doubled production. And it's definitely true to say that consumer production lagged behind, as always, and there were still major shortages, and major shortages in housing too. That's an area that isn't really focused on and prioritised by Stalin. Nevertheless, between 1945 and 1950, the Soviet economy was the fastest growing economy in the world. So that's genuine success there. But you would say within that, it only really recovers in areas where unskilled labour makes the difference. So there's a lack of investments, for instance, in the new industries like plastics and chemicals, and that is going to hold the Soviet Union economy back further into the future, even a little bit immediately in the 50s. The grain harvest, just to return to the agriculture thing, the grain harvest had been 96 million tonnes in 1940. During the war, partly because of the Nazi invasion, covered areas that were the main grain producing areas, such as the Ukraine and Belarus, the western kind of areas of Russia. The grain production then fell from 96 million tonnes in 1940 to just 30 million tonnes in 1942 and 1943. That had recovered a bit by the end of the war and was back up at 66 in 1947, so kind of two-thirds of what it had been. By 1952, it was up to 92 million tonnes. So it had been 96 in 1940, 92 million tonnes in 1952. And actually, that was an increase on 51 and 50. So it's still just about getting back up to that point. The other thing to note here is in the rebuilding that military expenditure was also increased. That started increased, of course, in the third five-year plan with rearmament, and it continues to be a big swallower of government expenditure after the war because of the start of the Cold War and the plans to build, well, in fact, by 1949, had built an atomic bomb, and that's very expensive to kind of invest in. So military expenditure is up about 42% from 80 million rubles to 114 million rubles, 1945 to 50. By 1952, military expenditure was swallowing up a quarter of all government spending. And that's big. When you think of our GDP target for military spending now in Britain is 2%. Again, 25% of government spending. It's a slightly different measure, but it illustrates how huge that is. So how is Stalin doing this? Well, a lot of the methods of the fourth five-year plan will be very familiar to you. State control, central planning. They tried to fund it partly by getting reparations from Germany, which was sort of agreed with the Allies, sort of somewhat reluctantly. They do give them permission to take stuff, and they literally take that in kind in lots of places by unscrewing things from factories in East Germany and shipping them back to the Soviet Union, sometimes taking the people with them at gunpoint. Trade agreements with Eastern Europe are struck in the late 40s. Also, slave labour, 2 million slave labourers from the gulags help push forward this 4 5-year plan. Also, the focus of it was very much, as I have been before, 88% of investment in the 4 5-year plan was in heavy industry and just 12% in food and consumables, which is why it's great that consumer goods doubled in their output, but not necessarily so exciting when you drill down to the details. Just talk a little bit about agriculture. Grain procurement in 1946 made up 70% or up to 70% of the yield. What I mean by that is the Soviets going in and taking that grain from the farmers to use to feed people in cities and towns. And that's I guess, legitimate under a communist rule, but up to 70%, of course, means there's very little left for the farmers and to plant the following year. 1946, 47, there was a famine, about 1.5 million people died, partly through requisitioning, but also through drought. So weather and kind of policy combined there. State control increased in agriculture in these years. They consolidated the colcots into even bigger farms. So just 94,000, not just 94,800 farms by the end of 1952. And the lack of focus on living conditions meant that villagers were not allowed access to state power stations. They couldn't get electricity from state power stations. And no building materials were provided to allow them to rebuild homes. So still in the Soviet Union, if you're a peasant working hard in your village to provide grain for the nation, you're still being undervalued and still quite badly off. It wasn't all kind of peace and harmony in the cities either. In Leningrad, for instance, workers had to contribute to reconstruction over and above their working days. So in Leningrad, all workers were expected to contribute 30 hours of reconstruction work a month on top of their regular 8-hour day shifts. If you're a student, it was 10 hours a month you had to contribute. If you're a non-worker, 60 hours a month because you had more time on your hands. But everyone was expected to contribute over and above their normal working day. So that's kind of how they did it. Let's think a little bit about, step back and kind of look at the big picture. Just think about the change continuity aspects. Continuity is really easy to see in Stalin's economic policies. He is fairly consistent. There's a consistent focus on heavy industry. Right from the start, he's been interested in collectivizing agriculture, drawing farms together into these sort of mass factory farm type things. And of course, within that, the idea of central planning. As I said in the last video, it's not really planning so much as just target setting, but nevertheless, this sort of central idea of control, centralized control. Living standards remain a low priority all the way through, and consumer goods remain a low priority all the way through, or certainly lower than heavy industry. And also, I think you could argue that this is always a low skill economy because of the focus on heavy industry, coal, oil, steel. These are kind of things that unskilled workers can contribute to fairly straightforwardly. Um, Use of gulag labour as well has been pretty consistent since the mid 30s, since like the purges really kick off, and since around that time as well, military investment has remained high. So kind of half of the period from 1928 to 53, you would say military investment, rearmament, and then maintenance has been a consistent feature. Change quite a lot harder to find, to be honest, and you need to be a little bit probably a little bit more specific in your changes that you're picking out. So I'd say the fact that rearmament and military funding was a priority for the second half shows that it wasn't for the first half, and that therefore is a change from the 1928 launch of economic change. Although you would say that in that 1931 speech about not being beaten, there's already a sign there that Stalin is doing this in order to make the Soviet Union strong. So maybe not huge change. Second five-year plan definitely had much more of a focus on consumables. You might argue that the doubling of consumer goods in the fourth five-year plan shows a reversion to that. But here and there is an acknowledgement that actually you can't just keep plugging away with heavy industry, that you do need to look out for the people as well. The Stakhanovite movement, I think, is really important here from 1935. There is an acknowledgement that worker incentivization needs to happen. That's kind of linked with the consumer good thing. Remember that Stakhanov got this reward, 200 rubles, woo, and other bits and bobs that were given to him, and that was promoted as a way of kind of making people want to work hard. And there are some changes, of course, in agriculture policy here and there too. And again, you'd probably look at the early years, that whole dizzy with success thing, where they collectivise and then stop collectivising because everyone's slaughtering their animals, and then start collectivising again. And then perhaps here in the fourth five-year plan, consolidating those colcots back into even bigger farms. So there's probably more of a development there of and probably you say that with the military too, development of policy rather than change of policy. By and large, though, pretty consistent. And maybe that's why, actually, I was looking back through the past questions, maybe that's why the questions that have been asked have been less about change and continuity, although that would be a legitimate question to ask, and more about successes versus failures. So let's just finish by sort of wrapping up Stalin's economic policies and think about those successes and failures. Successes, again, probably right themselves in many ways, and they had genuinely become now an industrial nation, and that is down to Stalin's policy, that he has directed them into rapid industrialization, and through that he has helped create a superpower. I think there's a pretty good argument for saying that the proof of that is in their ability to out manufacture Germany in the Second World War. And actually, that I haven't got that stat with me, but that would be a good stat to have a look at. The production of tanks and planes by the Soviet Union by the end of the Second World War shows how well that heavy industry was working for them. So that's the kind of the big success, I would say. And then the speedy recovery after the Second War shows that foundation is still there, foundation of skill and also of industry, to allow them to repeat the success of the 30s, or relative success of the 30s. And you'd have to say within that collectivization did provide what Stalin wanted, which was the exports of grain that fueled industrialization and allowed for this all to happen. So those are the big headline successes. The failures, again, kind of write themselves, don't they? The heavy industry focus means that they are actually constructing really quite an old-fashioned economy, even as they construct it, particularly after the Second World War. Plastics and chemicals are going to be, you won't be surprised to learn, big parts of industry and economics in the next sort of 20 to 30 years and 50 to 60 years. And the Soviet Union just aren't really on the ball kind of forging forwards. They're still looking at heavy industry as you might have done in the 19th century. There's a focus on quantity rather than quality, and on gigantomania, big projects, rather than getting things right. And that's a problem for Stalin. because things just don't work. And coupled with that, of course, the falsification of statistics by Soviet officials because they're worried about getting into trouble. So we're never quite sure whether we trust the figures that we see. And then, of course, the biggest failure, in my view, is the human cost of all this, the amount of gulag labour that is used and the amount of gulag labour that is wasted, killed, allowed to die as part of those projects, and the famines that occur, partly due to policy and partly due to kind of inept management, both in the 30s and the smaller famine that still kills at 1.5 million people in 46, 47. Just one more thing to add to the successes while I think about it, just driving by, that gulag, use of gulag stuff does allow them to open up areas of the Soviet Union that had been kind of beyond the pale of industry before. So opening up Siberia, for instance, is a success, but the cost of that is the use of gulag labour. Overall, it's really hard, isn't it? It's that weighing up of industry against the human cost. And I think that it comes down to a little bit about whether you think that they could have survived the Second World War ultimately without industrialization. And if they couldn't, then maybe the success is bigger. And if you think maybe they could, then probably the failures and cost is too high. I hope that helps. Next time we'll move on to the life after Stalin and looking at Khrushchev and his political situation. See you there.